So what I do now is I've been working at the University of Idaho. I came as a postdoc to work on a large program that studies salmon migration in the Columbia and Snake Rivers that was started in the late 90s, actually. It's one of the largest radio telemetry projects in the world and one of the longest running ones. It was led by Chris Perry, who was my advisor for several years in the 2000s. And since 2008, I've run this program, and it's a big program. It involves a bunch of staff scientists, a couple postdocs, graduate students, a whole bunch of seasonal and full-time technicians, and a very large number of collaborators at other institutions. And what our main objective is to understand how salmon migrate through regulated rivers, particularly ESA-listed salmon. Okay, so that's kind of my background. The real reason I'm here is because Rachel Clark, who's in the SuperPod, is a fantastic person at connecting people with ideas. And through her connecting with the SuperPod and talking with Jeff and the host, this opportunity came up for me to be able to talk, which I'm really grateful for. So as we were driving out here, we were talking about this talk that I was going to give, and we'd recently seen Damnation, and Avery, my 13-year-old son, basically summed it all up and said, the answer to all salmon problems is C4, which is an explosive for anybody who doesn't know that. And with that, I can take any questions. All right, well, unfortunately, the answer is a little bit more nuanced than that, as I hope to convince you by the end of tonight's talk. So my aims are to review salmon ecology because there's been, I've sort of talked with several people and they want to learn. I'm hoping you want to hear about salmon because that's what you're going to hear about. So what I'd like to do is walk through a thumbnail of salmon ecology, their evolution, and then their history in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm going to focus a lot on the Columbia River for really two reasons. One is that it's likely that the southern resident whales consume a lot of those fish during their period in the coastal waters when they're offshore, not in the Salish Sea. But more importantly, it's what I know about. So that's the second reason. And then at the end, I'll share with you the very, very little bit that I've learned in the past 4 days on salmon as a food source for salmon or southern resident colorist. And Ken will probably correct me after I'm done. Or perhaps while I'm done. I asked him to come up and give those slides. And at the end, I'm going to do something that I don't normally get to do as a scientist. I'm going to take off my scientist hat because it's this group. I'm going to kind of wave my hands about some unknowns that are scientific, but also think about some things in a much broader context. Okay. So the evolution of salmonids. Salmonids have been around for quite a long time, but since the dinosaurs, so the first known salmonid in the fossil record is about 50 million years old. The major extant groups were established by the end of the Miocene, 24 to 5 million years ago. And these major lineages, evolutionary lineages, are represented basically by a group of different genuses. And those are listed up there. Interestingly, all of the salmonids were restricted to the northern hemisphere historically, until 150 years ago or so. These are those representatives of those major lineages. Taimen are in Mongolia, the largest freshwater salmonid. They reach about 70 pounds. There's a minor industry. Fly fishing for those now, you drag big flies across the water and they slam them. Bull trout and brook trout are representatives of the char lineage, Salmonius. This is a brown trout in the genus Salmo, which also includes Atlantic salmon. And then Oncorhynchus includes the Pacific salmons that all spawn and die, and rainbow trout and steelhead. Steelhead being the sea-run version of rainbow trout. And that's a big Chinook. Okay. So the rise of Pacific salmon occurred in the last 2 to 5 million years ago, and these major Species appear to have been established by then. The diversification of subspecies occurred in the Pleistocene, and by subspecies I mean things like spring, summer, and fall Chinook salmon. I'll talk more about those. Those names come from the time of year that the adults come back, and so spring Chinook and fall Chinook have been separated for quite some time. Okay. And to give you kind of a point of reference, the orca resident and transient ecotypes appear to have been separated for time periods that are on the same order, okay, 20,000 years or more. After the glaciation, there was recolonization of many areas. I'll show you a map of that in just a second. And a rapid genetic diversification for a variety of reasons. One is the high fecundity of individuals. Females can lay thousands of eggs per generation. There's strong selection that occurs on those eggs for adaptations to the local conditions. There's a relatively short generation time of about 5 years, and salmon home to the same location, in some cases on the scale of meters, after 4 or 5 years at sea and traveling thousands or tens of thousands of kilometers. And I'll explain how that works in just a minute. Again, since the Industrial Revolution, salmonids have been widely introduced worldwide. Rainbow trout have been introduced wider than almost any other species, and occurs in any place that they can persist. Brown trout occur in many, many places. You can fish for trout in almost every state in the United States, including Texas and Arkansas below dams, and those are often brown trout or rainbow trout. These are the major players on the west coast. Masu salmon also occur in the western Pacific, in Japan. A lot of what I'm going to focus on is Chinook salmon or king salmon, because again, those are a major food source for orca. The life cycle, at least in broad thumbnail, is probably familiar to most of you. Salmon are anadromous, meaning that they spawn in fresh water and then they go to sea to put on much of their growth. About 95% of their biomass is put on in the ocean. They do that over the course of a couple of years. They use a variety of cues to return to their natal river, swim upstream, and again, Pacific salmons, all the Pacific salmons die after spawning once, right? Spawn hard, die free is the Ray Troll t-shirt, right? After eggs are in the gravel over the winter, typically, they emerge, go through early life history stages where there's high mortality, and then fry, rear in fresh water for the period of weeks to months to years, depending on the species. Chinook salmon, in some cases, migrate to the ocean after a couple of months. In other populations, they can be in fresh water for up to 2 years prior to migrating to the ocean. One of the most remarkable things, again, about salmon is their ability to find their way home to their natal streams, and this has allowed that really high specialization in localized habitats, again, at the scale of literally meters. In some cases, there'll be a genetically distinct population in a stream that is 10 meters away from a beach where sockeye salmon that are genetically distinct are spawning, and they're adapted to those two different habitats. And the way this works is juveniles, as they outmigrate, they sense chemicals in their home stream and then remember this chemical milieu as they return migrate. And sometimes they'll wander up the wrong stream and then come back down until they come back up to their natal stream. Okay. So those olfactory memories, once they get into fresh waters, are the major driver for their ability to find their way home. Okay. And I think I said all of that already. Okay. So if we look at where the genus Oncorhynchus occurs, It is across a vast swath of the globe, from Baja, Mexico, where there are some steelhead populations, all the way into southern Japan and South Korea, and most of the ocean in between during that marine growth phase. Again, one of the things that is somewhat remarkable, at least to me, is that an awful lot of their habitat 12,000 years ago was not there, right? So this is the extent of glacial maximum. This is the coastline because sea levels were lower. And in the last 12,000 years, those fish have recolonized and again adapted at very fine local scales to those conditions. If we look at Chinook salmon, we see a very similar distribution, although not quite as extensive. The southernmost populations are primarily in the Central Valley and Central California, ranging over to the Kamchatka, which we heard some about last night. The Columbia Basin is here, and those big red areas are now areas that are inaccessible to Chinook salmon because of impassable dams. And this was really a production pump for many, many years. Lots and lots of fish came out of the Chinook salmon came out of the Columbia Basin. So what I'd like to do now is really kind of zoom into the Columbia Basin, at least in the relative scale. This is still a very large area extending up into Canada, a large part of Idaho, a large part of Washington and Oregon. And there were even, historically, there were some Chinook salmon that actually reached Nevada. I know that all of you think about salmon when you hear the word Nevada. Me either. Okay, so I'm going to walk through a little bit of the natural history of the Columbia Basin, talk a little bit more about the specifics of Chinook in the Columbia Basin now, because that's what we have now. And then I'll talk about the 4-H's with a twist. And I'll explain that in a minute. Okay. So the Columbia Basin, again, is large. 7 states and a big chunk of Alberta. It's roughly the size of France or Texas, which it's odd to me that Texas and France are about the same size. The annual discharge, it's the second largest river by discharge in North America. 265,000 cubic feet per second. If you go rafting on a medium-sized river, the flows are often in the 2,000 to 3,000 cubic feet per second. The maximum discharge was 1.25 million cubic feet per second, and that was recorded at the Dalles in 1894. That record is quite old, even though we've had some very large precipitation and runoff events. 1997 would have probably broken that record by a long shot. Any guesses as to why that discharge hasn't been beat since 1894? Dams and regulation and withdrawals, exactly. So it's a really highly regulated system. Again, a major tributary is the Snake River, which is 1,100 miles long. Again, runs deep into Idaho, and I already threw my punchline about Nevada. Again, this was a really important salmon pump for the North Pacific. The annual returns, understanding what the historic baseline is really challenging because lots of impacts happened before there was any way to quantify the number of fish coming back. The reconstructions that have been attempted suggest that the historic numbers returning of all species was in the 10 to 30 million per year. That's a lot of fish. That abundance of fish as a resource and the fact that those fish came in almost every month of the year into the lower Columbia and through most of the year in the upper Columbia led to the rise of diverse native cultural diversity, a large number of tribes. Many of those were in place for a very long period of time. And in fact, the Celilo Falls on the Columbia River It has been cited as the longest continuously inhabited community in North America, being with people visiting it, at least on an annual basis, for nearly as long as the glaciers have been gone. Okay, so a really long time. Until 1957, when it was flooded by the Dalles Dam. And the 50th anniversary of that was not too long ago, and it was very, very poignant to see some interviews of natives who were there and watched Saliwa be inundated. These, there was at least one other site on Snake River that was inundated in the mid-70s when the Snake River, lower Snake River dams went in, and that encampment had been visited over the period of 10,000 years as well. So we, before this, we don't have good numbers, but again, the numbers were quite a lot. This is Chinook commercial landings in millions of pounds, I believe. We don't have numbers of fish, so we use the landing records. But the trend is pretty darn clear. It shot up with the onset of industrial fishing, bounced around for a long time, and then there's this long period of decline. Each of these yellow dots is the construction of a major main stem dam. And on the one hand, it's not rocket science to see a correlation here, right? In 1991, the Snake River Chinook salmon and several other stocks, or ESUs, were listed under the Endangered Species Act. Currently, less than 1 to about 3 million adult salmonids come back to the Columbia Basin per year. So approximately 1/10 of the historic abundance. If we think about, again, all of the salmon stocks on the West Coast under the Endangered Species Act, one of the really great things about the Endangered Species Act is it recognizes distinct population segments, or evolutionary significant units, as they're referred to for salmon, as separate species. They can be managed as independent units. It's the reason why the southern residents are listed under the ESA. It's why many of the salmon species are listed under the ESA. If they did not have that legal recognition, Chinook salmon would never have been listed. And the many, many more populations would have gone extinct, as well as many other salmoniid populations. So there are 52 evolutionary significant units, or ESUs, along the West Coast. 26, exactly 1/2 of those, have been listed under the ESA. The Columbia River, it's so hard to get a historical number that even my own numbers don't match up. It has 12 listed ESUs. The Snake River has 4 listed ESUs. The Snake River, I'll focus a little bit on, again, because I know it, but it was also a major producer of Chinook salmon. And the runs of Chinook salmon that came back historically were among some of the largest fish around, often reaching 100 pounds. Okay. All Chinook salmon spawn in the fall, even those that come back in the spring or in the summer. Some Chinook salmon start coming back as early as March. The ones that come back to Idaho typically come back in May. They migrate upstream to headwater tributaries as far as 1,100 kilometers and a mile of elevation from the ocean. And to give you some idea of that, I've driven from from Astoria and Portland to some of those field sites, and it's 2 very long days of driving. They do that over about the course of a month. They hold in those headwater tributaries for a couple of months doing nothing, waiting for temperatures to drop, and then they spawn in the fall. Fall Chinook salmon come in the fall Chinook, immediately spawn, and they die. The spring-summer Chinook, interestingly, are called stream type in some of the literature because they remain in freshwater for more than a year. Ironically, we've since found out that they rapidly migrate downstream when they smolt and go to the ocean. And rather than staying on the coastal shelf, they go offshore and feed in blue water habitats for 2 to 4 winters, most of them. Fall Chinook are called ocean type because they go to the ocean quickly, but they stay in coastal waters and feed again for 2 to 4 winters, most of them. Although there's quite a bit of variability in the age at return. In fact, some mature after 1 winter, and some don't go to the ocean at all, called jacks and mini jacks. Okay. Again, this is a long way, a very long distance, and they are subjected to a large number of potential impacts along these migration corridors. And one of the important things and one of the challenges for salmon is that to complete their life cycle, they've got to piece together access to marine growth habitats. For these interior populations, they have to make an arduous upstream migration, often over dams, and then find sufficient spawning and rearing habitat. And then those juveniles have to make that downstream migration, make a very difficult physiological transition from freshwater to saltwater, basically rearrange their entire metabolism, and then start feeding and avoid being eaten. Is everybody still with me? Good. All right. So the salmon wars have been ongoing since Europeans have really made it to the West Coast. They really flared up in the 70s and 80s and 90s as declines continued, and it turned into a real blame game. And so the 4 causes were sort of dubbed the 4 H's, and those were habitat, hatcheries, harvest, and hydropower. I'm just going to walk through these actually really quickly. We could spend, again, I'm trying to pack an entire course worth of material into 30 minutes here. So I'm just going to skim some of the major issues with each of these. The habitat issue is really challenging because it's widespread. There were intense impacts to nearly every watershed during colonization by Europeans in the 1880s through the 1930s, with intensive mining, grazing, and logging widespread throughout nearly all of the Pacific Northwest. At the same time was the development of commercial fisheries. The first hatcheries came online in the late 1800s, and the era of big dams ran from about 1930 to 1976, but there were many other dams that were built, small dams in headwaters to run mills, to float logs for running them downstream. Orchards were established starting in the 1880s, so there were many diversion dams. One of the major ongoing impacts is the Columbia Basin project that was started in 1948. Irrigation of 600,000 acres via canal system, so a lot of water is withdrawn for that and held back during spring runoff at upstream dams. That's the equivalent of 1,000 square miles, which is about the same size as Latah County, the county in Idaho where we live, which is coincidentally roughly the same size as Rhode Island. Okay? So we're irrigating an area equivalent to Rhode Island using Columbia River water every year to make things like apples, trout apples. We're literally turning fish into apples. So I'm a student of irony, sorry. Okay, Lewiston-Clarkston is at the confluence of the Clearwater River and the Snake River in Idaho and Washington. It's named after Lewis and Clark. It's America's most inland seaport. The lower Snake River dams are not the lower Snake River dams, they're the lower Snake River locks and dams, and those provide lockage for barges to reach Lewiston, primarily to help to take wheat off of the Palouse. Okay. And right now, there are more than 6 million people living in the watershed. So there's still a lot of ongoing impact to habitat because of a growing population. Introduced species are also an issue. This is a map of the number of introduced species by area, and in fact, Idaho now has more non-native species that have naturalized than it had native species. This is a picture of one of those log dams being broken down to let a log jam come down, and you can imagine what this did to the geomorphology of that stream channel. It turned it into a rain gutter, and many of those streams are likely still recovering from that. These are sheep. Okay, so high densities of sheep grazing. This up here is the Yakima River. This down here is not the Yakima River. The Yakima River is now here in this diversion canal for irrigation. And in the early days of diversion, often the entire river was dewatered for substantial periods of the year. Mining, in many cases, is a pretty extreme example, but not completely uncommon, where basically gold dredging took the entire stream bed and took it out of the stream bed and laid it up on the stream. And the Yankee River in Idaho is still a very degraded habitat because of that legacy mining effect. This picture I like because you can imagine what these logs do as they go downstream to that stream habitat, but you can also think about where these logs came from and what the upland habitat now looks like and what happens when rain falls on that habitat. This is a map of the Willamette Basin, which is in the Columbia Basin. We kind of often think about it a little bit differently because most of the Columbia Basin we think of as over here, but it is part of the Columbia Basin. This is national forest, this is industrial forest, this is agriculture, and the pink is urbanization. So we have large amounts of ongoing use, intensive land use for salmon watersheds. This is Portland, Oregon. This is Salem, Corvallis, and Eugene. And the Willamette Valley is one of the fastest growing areas around here. Okay, this is a classic pattern in fisheries ecology. These data were just published last year. These are 9 separate watersheds, many of them in wilderness areas in Idaho. On this axis is the number of smolts that were produced in that stream after this number of reds, or salmon nests, were counted by the adults that produced those smolts. And what you see is a very rapid rise up and then an asymptotic relationship where this levels out. And it's called a Richter curve, for the guy who named it, one of the grandfathers of fisheries science. And what you can see is that in nearly every one of these streams, the plateau happens after a red count of only 100 or 200 salmon nests in those streams. Even though some of these are rather large streams, and we also know that these streams harbor many more fish than a couple hundred fish spawning per year. It's probably the result of a number of things. One is low natural productivity of these systems. This is in Idaho wilderness that sits on largely granitic rocks, so there's not a lot of nutrients in the water to begin with. We talked about some of those legacy effects that change the stream channel and the complexity that allows the few nutrients to be retained. Because few adults have been coming back to those streams carrying marine-derived nutrients in the form of salmon carcasses that fertilize those streams for their offspring, we may be in sort of a negative feedback loop where it's hard to get the productivity going because the adults aren't coming back. Ongoing land use effects are part of this story. And one of the reasons I showed this slide is because the Richter curve is one of the rationales for heavy fishing pressure on salmon because they have 5 fecundity and freshwater habitats are limiting. Even in pristine habitats, you can take substantial portions of returning adults and not limit the number of juveniles going back to the ocean. And that is true up to about 50% of the adults in an undisturbed population. So this relationship is often used to justify fishing, rightly or wrongly. And it's sound at some level. But what's disturbing here is that this is so flat so quickly. It would be really good if this kept going up for a long way. And that was probably the historical situation. And ultimately, salmon recovery in many places may depend on increasing the carrying capacity of those rearing habitats. Okay, from ecology. Okay. Moving on to the second H, hydro and dams. Dams are a big part of the problem. They remain a large part of the problem, depending on how you think about it. The bad actors are probably the dams that continue to block access to about 43% of the habitat that salmon could historically reach. Okay. The shown in green here are the dams with fish passage facilities, and those facilities largely do a good job of passing adult salmonids. The adults can reach spawning grounds at about the same rates as they can in many other undammed systems, as best we can measure. There are ongoing issues, and that's a large part of what the research I do revolves around. The larger and the more challenging problem with these main stem dams is that they slow adult juveniles down as they go to the ocean, so it takes them longer. And many of those juveniles are captured and transported downstream on barges. I'll show some pictures of that in a minute. Both of those things may influence how well the fish do when they hit the ocean, and that's called delayed mortality. And that's an area of controversy and ongoing research. The dams have caused the extinction of many populations of adult salmonids and the loss of considerable diversity. These numbers here are the number of populations in each of these basins: the Central Valley of California, the Columbia Basin, Puget Sound, and the Fraser River. And I'm not sure if that's a 3 or an 8. Regardless, a large number of these populations are now extinct in the Columbia Basin. This clearly results in reduced abundance because there are fewer fish in those habitats being produced. But importantly, there's a loss of diversity of different life history types that can come back at different times of year and do things a little bit differently. And that loss of diversity has diminished what's called the portfolio effect. How many of you have stocks? Yeah, me either. But the idea, so they tell me, is that if you have a diverse portfolio, you might not have, you reduce the variance in your return rate, right? So you get a pretty smooth return rate. You don't crash and bounce up and down. And that creates a less, if you lose the portfolio effect, then you have a less predictable resource for consumers. Okay? And this is an important idea that we'll come back to towards the end. Is sort of an emerging idea in ecology, and it actually came out of the salmon literature and was demonstrated. The portfolio effect is one of the reasons why Alaska stocks are still doing so well, because some of those stocks have crashed and some have gone up, but because that system is relatively intact, the catch rate has stayed relatively stable to the benefit of both wildlife and human fishers. This one is for JJ and you.
Yep.
One of the first things I did when I got to Idaho was apply Cox proportional hazards regression that they talked about, to ask the question, if you think about how long it takes a fish to pass a dam, not to live, we see that all of the fish are there when we start the clock running, but within a couple of days, nearly more than half of the fish have passed. Most fish pass on the day they get there. But interestingly, the fish that were successful tend to pass dams faster than those that were eventually unsuccessful in making it to spawning grounds. We still don't know what the causes for this are. We don't know if those unsuccessful fish approach the dam, which is relatively arduous compared to swimming through, say, a reservoir, and were in poor condition to begin with, so they lollygag there, manage to pass the dam, and then die, or whether it's basically artificial selection. So that's for you guys.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay. The Columbia Basin is basically two rivers now for juvenile salmonids. They come downstream, and between a third and 2/3 travel in the river. It takes about 10 to 14 days, the historical 2 to 4 days, or about 5 days historically. Many of them are diverted at dams, put on barges that are special built for transporting smolts downstream. They make that journey in about 2 days and are released below Bonneville Dam, and in an effort to minimize mortality caused by the passage of dams, going through turbines, being collected on screens and diverted, or going through spillways. A relatively large proportion of these smolts can be transported. These numbers are for steelhead, and you can see that in some years, especially low water years, nearly all the fish are transported. The problem that we found is that returning adults, because we believe their imprinting was screwed up on their way out, have about 10% lower migration success as they come back upstream. And many of those fish end up in the wrong natal habitat. And that is of concern because then those fish can breed with fish from a non-native area and cause problems that I'll talk about in a minute. A lot of this appears to be driven by fallback, where fish, because their imprinting is probably disrupted, they will swim past their natal river down here. They'll pass a dam, decide, no, it's not up there, and then they'll fall back downstream. And this happens naturally in fish that travel inriver, but they never do it more than once or twice during their migration upstream. In some cases, salmon that had been barged will do this 7, 8 times, okay? And actually survive doing it. Many of them apparently do it and don't survive. Dams the fish passage facilities at dams were designed with salmon in mind during the beginning in the 30s and through the 70s and 80s. They were not designed for other native fishes, and in particular, they were not designed for eels. The natives call them eels. They're actually lamprey. They're not related to eels. They are an amazing fish, and they used to come back in really high densities. This is Willamette Falls. One of the amazing things about lamprey is that they have a sucking disc that they use to parasitize marine prey. When they come back to freshwater, they stop feeding. They can scale a vertical surface if it has sheeting water on it. So if you just have a vertical surface with a little bit of water, they can literally flip themselves up and ascend that. Okay? They have a life cycle that's almost the same to adult salmonids, except that they're in soft sediments for 4 to 7 years filter feeding, and then they go to the ocean for, we think, a couple of years, and in an odd twist of regulatory fate, because they're in freshwater longer than they're in the ocean, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has jurisdiction over lamprey instead of NOAA Fisheries, which has jurisdiction over salmon. Go figure. Okay. Lamprey have been around for a long time. They're some of the first fishes 450 million years ago. I mean, shortly after the rise of vertebrates, way before the age of dinosaurs. Again, salmon, in the neighborhood of 6 million years. So these guys have been around for a long time. They're important to native tribes culturally as a subsistence food, as a medicinal food, and it's basic. They've been in decline. We don't have good counts on them because the count facilities weren't designed for them, but the index counts that we have, this is the Snake River at Lower Granite Dam, so these are the fish that would be coming into Idaho, and these are, this is 2008, 9, 10, and 11, 61, 12, 15, 48 fish. We know from some of our telemetry studies that about half the fish that approach a dam will actually pass it. And lamprey do not home. And so one of the ongoing areas of investigation is whether they're making adaptive decisions when they see basically a mountain range and they decide to go spawn downstream somewhere. But what we do know is that there aren't fish making it into the interior streams. And this is of concern because they were bringing marine-derived nutrients in. And again, those larvae are in the stream for a long time, pulling nutrients out of the water column, potentially increasing that carrying capacity for salmon through their interactions through nutrients. And I just accepted a graduate student who's going to address some of this, I hope. Okay. Harvest is an easy scapegoat because it's visible. We do a lot of it. We've been doing it for a long time. The native tribes took large portions of mini runs, but obviously not enough to cause decline. The large-scale industrial fishing strongly impacted and probably helped extirpate some stocks. Harvest rates are currently set by a complex set of rules and treaties. I fortunately managed to stay mostly out of this realm because it can be challenging because it's politicized. I'm getting drug in despite my efforts. The ongoing biggest issue is for small wild populations that are ESA listed but are captured in mixed stock fisheries in the coastal ocean and in the Columbia River. And there is ongoing tension between tribes and states and commercial and recreational fishermen. Hatcheries have supposedly been part of the solution since the beginning. A great example of progressive early industrial revolution thinking where technology could solve any problem. There are lots of problems with hatcheries. In the early days, interbasin transfers were common. So remember, salmon are often finely tuned to their local habitats. Hatchery managers took salmon that they had grown from someplace and figured out how to grow them really fast and just transported them to another place because it was convenient. And leading to a mismatch between native and introduced stocks and what's called outbreeding depression, where an outside genetic stock basically lowers your fitness and your adaptability to the local conditions because now you're a mongrel. And you were a specialist and now you're a generalist. And you need to be a specialist to be successful in the spot where you are. We continue to produce huge numbers of fish and put them in the ocean, and that can induce competition in the ocean. There are now more salmon in the ocean than ever before in the history of the world for a variety of reasons. One is there are a lot of them in the southern hemisphere now. The other is because hatcheries pump lots into the ocean. There are problems with how individuals are selected for broodstock. In the early days, they would take the first individuals that showed up at the hatchery because they wanted to make their quota and make their life easier. That led to selection for earlier run timing. So again, further mismatch from the local conditions. There are changes in behavior and survival. I heard somebody talking about the fact that some people think that hatchery fish don't school as tightly in the ocean, and that makes it harder for workers to forage for them. We know that there are differences in behavior in the smolts because Caspian terns take about 2 to 4% of the smolts during the outmigration in the lower Columbia River. Lots of those smolts that are taken are hatchery fish because they sit high on the water column. This is an ongoing problem. Many hatchery fish return to streams and aren't collected by the hatchery, and they end up mixing with the wild fish that return to those same populations, and a variety of studies have shown negative impacts on wild salmon. This is something of large concern, and I'll show an example of that in just a second. Because we're pumping so many hatchery fish out, we continue to get adults back. People have something to fish for, and they do not become concerned about wild salmon and habitat. Okay. All of that said, like any good tool, it can be used to good effect. Hatcheries have been used to reestablish some populations and to maintain some critically endangered populations that would have otherwise gone extinct. And there are conservation hatcheries that are doing it well, and it can be part of the solution. But within the hatchery world, as you can imagine, there is a huge range of opinion and cultures in terms of how people view how hatcheries should be done. This is a graphic showing the number of hatcheries worldwide, many in Japan, lots in the Pacific Northwest, and I forgot to look to see what the numbers here are. I can't remember if this is the number of hatcheries or the number of fish released. It's the number of hatcheries. So 378 hatcheries in Japan. 18 in Idaho, 32 in Oregon, 88 in Washington. British Columbia, 199. Okay. So this was the kind of the state of the salmon wars for decades, up into the early part of the listing. Again, the listings for most of the ESUs happened in the early 90s. People were, every H pointed at the other H's and said it's your fault. And this was what the counts looked like in terms of the Chinook run and hatchery returns. Here's the ESA listing. We're trending down. And as it turns out, the big zinger in this whole thing has turned out to be climate. Because this is what happened shortly after the ESA listing. There was a change in the ocean regime, moving towards much cooler conditions, favoring Pacific Northwest salmon in offshore conditions, and numbers took off. Okay. Note, the vast majority of those fish that came back were hatchery fish. Again, masking, continued poor returns of wild fish. This is just a graphic of that PDO effect, where this is the Pacific decadal oscillation. It's similar to an ENSO measure or an El Nino measure of ocean conditions, basically measuring how cold this area is. So when it's relatively, the PDO is positive, temperatures are cool, there's lots of upwelling, lots of production of copepods. Juvenile salmon do well and return in high numbers. I might be getting this all backwards. Yeah, so when PDO is negative, it's good for salmon. Sorry. Okay. So to review, this is C4 would be a good answer to solve all these problems. The problem is it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. Habitat, legacy effects, land use, introduced species, irrigation, hydropower, blocks passage, harvest, hatcheries, loss of the portfolio effect, climate issues, and shifted baseline. Again, part of the issue is culturally we've lost the sense that the Pacific Northwest should have 10 to 30 million salmon coming back, and we're not culturally as a society willing to change our habits well enough to allow that to happen. And it continues to get more complex, right? So here's a graphic that I drew, and it's if you have orcas here that are eating salmon, all of these things are happening to salmon with the big five here, but they're all interconnected, and it's getting worse, right? How many of you have used Google in the last week? Okay. Google is a forward-thinking company. They want to have green energy. So every time you do a Google search, you are using quite a bit of electricity from Columbia River dams. The Dalles in Oregon, the site of the Dalles Dam, one of the biggest producers, now has a very large Google installation where their engineers run their server farms. Central Washington is becoming awash in server farms because of the cheap energy and the desire for these companies to appear green by not running their server farms on fossil fuels. Okay? So it's complicated. Sorry to break. Yeah. Okay. Are we good for another couple minutes? Okay. I'm going over time, and I apologize for that. So I want to talk for a few minutes about salmon and the connection to orcas. And again, it's going to be short because my knowledge is thin. NOAA issued a status update after 10 years after the listing, and this was kind of what I took away from it. The major things that I took away from it are these. This is the time series from 1974 to 2012, this is remarkably unlike fish, which do go all over the place because orcas have they're long-lived and they have a few number of offspring, right? The thing that I really took away from this is that almost half the population was lost from captures. But there was an uptick, but this population isn't going up or down. That's not good, right? As a population ecologist, this doesn't look too bad because it's stable. That's the good news. But it's not going back up. If you remove half a population, then presumably they have more resources to replace themselves and start to increase. The other thing that I took away from this is that they eat a lot of Chinook salmon, which has been relatively well established. This graph jumped out at me. This is basically time budgets for when there are boats around and not boats around, and they travel more when there are boats and forage less. But the big thing here for me is that they're spending 60 to 70% of their time foraging. What does that suggest to you?
Less fish.
Less fish. How much of your time do you spend foraging? Okay. So these are the two slides that I've got that Ken should really be presenting. In 2010, there was a published study. There was a really nice paper where they chased orcas around for 4 summers in their summer range and collected their leftovers from feeding events and collected their poop, and then ran the genetics on the poop to figure out which salmon stocks the fish came from and used scales to identify which species it was. Again, it supported that conclusion that this is where the data for that pie chart came from. They eat a lot of Chinook. And in their summer range, they eat mostly Fraser River Chinook salmon. That's these numbers, June, July. They're eating lots of Chinook from the Fraser River. And sadly, I can't tell you much about Chinook salmon from the Fraser River because I just don't know that much about them. The other slide that I will show you is from some acoustic monitoring along the Pacific Shelf at these locations. And when the fish were out on the shelf in March and April, they spent most of their time being recorded at these 2 sites near the mouth of the Columbia River, which also happens to be the time when Columbia River spring Chinook salmon are likely aggregating here and staging as they're making their migration and coming through for their migration up the Columbia and Snake River. So one of the other things that jumped out is that the summer residents spend their summer here, but they spend more than half their days offshore along the coastal shelf. And some recent telemetry studies have shown that they do range widely up and down the coast. And because of that, it means that because of these 2 things, the southern residents are just like salmon in the sense that they have to piece together a couple of reliable resources over the course of a year to be able to make a living. Right? So if you start to lose salmon, Fraser River Chinook, you're going to go lean during the summer. If you don't have Columbia River Chinook coming back in large numbers during the spring, it's going to be lean. And one of the other things that jumped out at me as I was doing this reading is this fact here. It's likely to me that orcas focus on Chinook salmon, and they can recognize them through echolocation that it's a Chinook salmon based on their acoustic signal from the swim bladder that's specific. Because they're cheeseburgers, right? They're not fries, they're not rice, they're cheeseburgers. The problem is that the serving size has been going down. Ricker, the same guy from the Ricker curves, noted in 1980 that Chinook body size has declined by 50% since the 1920s. And this is and the age of Chinook salmon that return has been declining during that time too. And it's almost certainly been driven in part by size selective fishing. We take the biggest fish out and there's selection for return at smaller body size before you get nabbed. Okay? And this is what that looks like. The average from 1950 to 1970 in Area 1 of the Fraser River test fishery dropped from 22 to 16%, 12%, or 12 kilograms per fish to 8 kilograms per fish. Okay. So foraging ecology gets really complex really quickly. But what we do know is if you spend more time chasing smaller food, you don't get as much energy. Okay. So what to do about all of it? Well, I'm still wearing my scientist hat. And again, summer residents spend less than half the time in inland waters. We don't know what the role of other salmon stocks in their foraging ecology is. We don't have much information on that. Their time in the coastal ocean is largely a black box that, thanks to the listing in part, has caused some research money and results to flow from the coastal period. We don't know what the relative importance of what happens in the Salish Sea compared to the coastal ocean is. And whether, if things were bad in the coastal ocean, does that influence the time they spend in the summer here and vice versa. We don't know how flexible their foraging behavior is, or we probably do. I don't, so I put it up here. I doubt that it's very flexible, otherwise they would probably be eating a lot of ice in the form of sockeye salmon they're going by. Climate effects, of course, are a really big unknown and of great worry to lots of people. And again, the legacy impacts and current impacts of what we do on salmon diversity, I mean, it's going to be hard to recover from some of those in the short term. So in terms of legal pathways, one of the things that I don't know whether there's some leverage to be had in terms of using orca to help leverage salmon recovery. There may be some, because some of the information that has been coming out didn't find its way into the NOAA biological opinion for the recovery of federal Columbia River power system, the BIOP, the prescription for recovering salmon in the Columbia River. There's a section on orca in there, but it doesn't have a lot of information because when they wrote it, there wasn't as much information as there is now. So there may be a leverage point there. There may be other leverage points. Okay. So finally, Samantha Berg noted in her talk the other night that the orca captivity problem is solvable. And I thought this was a really great and astute observation. And it really touches people because of our natural empathy for these beautiful creatures, but I think also because it's solvable, right? Okay. Unfortunately, this fisheries ecology isn't rocket science. It's much more complicated than that. I hope I've convinced you of that, if nothing else. Right? This is a quote that floats around a lot. It's attributed to a bunch of people. And in short, this basically boils down to the fact that natural resource problems are rarely resource problems, right? We often know what to do. We know enough about the resource to manage and conserve it. Rather, it's almost always that we have a people problem. So one of the things that I'm becoming more interested in is how do we motivate change in our social system so that we can turn the tide. And Rachel, my wife, thinks about these things too. Again, she's really good at connecting ideas and synthesizing things. And if you haven't seen it, her blog has some of these connections. She doesn't spend as much time writing on it as she might like, but it's all good stuff. So I think this idea that orcas can be a gateway problem to larger issues and galvanize action, that was brought up in the last talk. I think that's true. But the problem with salmon is we have it's embedded in this really big human social system where we don't have a true accounting of the economic costs of the things we do. My students, undergraduates in their junior years at a major state university, they don't know what an ecological footprint is. Who knows what an ecological footprint is? Ecological footprint is the idea if you consumed all of the resources that you use, how many Earths would it take to support the current human population? And there are online calculators to do this. They're kind of cool. I was horrified to find that You know, we have chickens in our backyards. We were a one-car family for a long time. We try to do everything that we can, but I still consume like 2.7 Earths or 4 Earths, depending on the calculator, and how much work flying I do. Flying is a huge one. Which speaks to the fact that a large part of the problem is our systems don't give us choices to do the right thing, and there's no societal expectation to do the right thing. I've taken off my scientist hat a while ago, did you notice? And our systems don't have a true accountability for the impacts, right? One of the reasons why the salmon continues to be a big problem regionally is everybody can point the finger to everybody else, and nobody is willing to admit that they're part of the problem. I think that the salmon problem is actually a really interesting parallel case study to what we're struggling with right now at a global level with greenhouse gases. And so perhaps the great frontier is to ask how do we make these collective decisions where there's sort of a diffuse enemy, right? This isn't like an asteroid coming at Earth. It's climate change happens slowly, salmon decline happens slowly. It's something that you don't necessarily see in your everyday life. And I think that there are going to be some interesting things at the intersection of psychology, political science, religion and ethics, economics, and environmental science in coming years. Okay. Well, the prognosis, frankly, is for southern Chinook salmon stocks is not rosy. Climate change and continued population growth mean that it's going to be really hard to recover salmon in a meaningful way back to historic levels, which is a depressing thought. I take some solace in the fact that salmon are basically water rats. You know, they recolonized the entire western northern hemisphere after glaciation. They did it really quickly and they did it really well. Snake River Fall Chinook were one of those endangered ESA stocks. Less than 1,000 of them came back several years in a row. They are now teeming, in part because there was a well-done hatchery supplementation program for many years. One of the things that I study right now is Chinook salmon that are transported above dams in an effort to get marine-derived nutrients up to those systems for bull trout, which are also ESA listed. Some of those smolts somehow make it past impassable lanes that have really high mortality, and they do really well when they go to the ocean because they grow up in the reservoirs and get really large before they hit the salt. So we still have a lot of diversity that can still be expressed, and salmon are actually adapting themselves to living with us, which is encouraging. And in the long view, if I sort of think like a Buddhist and really take the big picture, salmon aren't going to go away probably because they made it through a glaciation and they really have diversified since then. Okay. And I think I've probably said enough, but this is a great comment. Anyway, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them.